Welcome to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. I'm Dr. Karlo, Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa in eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9, and across the entire Oklahoma Catholic Radio network of 15 stations, including 97.3 FM in Oklahoma City, 100.9 in Edmond, and 88.3 FM in Lawton. But you may be listening at a different time on your own local Catholic station outside Oklahoma, since the Catholic Reason is aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. Regardless of where you're at, welcome and thanks for joining me today. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. That's the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. And you can also access the archived episodes at my website, karlobroussard.com, under both the audio and video tab. And be sure to check out all the other great resources that I have available there for you at my website. In a previous episode, specifically episode 33 of The Catholic Reason, entitled Why Jesus' Miracles Are Fact and Not Fiction, I give reasons to believe that Jesus' miracles are indeed fact and not fiction. And we looked at a few lines of evidence. First, we showed that both the narrative and non-narrative accounts of Jesus as a healer are multiply attested to, thereby meeting the criterion of multiple attestation. And they're attested to by 5 independent sources: Mark, the Q tradition, Special Matthew, Special Luke, and John. These are the independent source traditions that the gospel writers are pulling from, Q being that unnamed or unknown source tradition that seemingly both Matthew and Luke are pulling from at various parts of their gospels. Second, we spent some time looking at the historicity of a specific healing narrative, the healing of blind Bartimaeus, as recorded in Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. Now, I'm not going to rehash those arguments for historicity here. Again, check out the episode, Why Jesus' Miracles Are Fact and Not Fiction. What I'd like to do today is pick up from where I left off and continue to provide evidence for the historicity of other healing narratives. And the 4 that I'm going to look at in today's episode are, number 1, the cure of the centurion's or official's son/servant, as recorded in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13, Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, and John chapter 4, verses 46 through 54. So that'll be the first specific narrative of a healing that we look at today. Secondly, the paralyzed man let down through the roof, as recorded by Mark in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Thirdly, the paralyzed man by the pool of Bethesda in John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. And fourthly, the healing of the deaf mute in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. So with these 4 specific narratives, combined with the healing narrative of the blind man Bartimaeus that we've looked at in a previous episode, that would make 5 specific narratives that we can conclude are historically reliable and coming from the first century and Jesus himself, thereby giving us reason to conclude that Jesus is indeed a healer, and that portrait of Jesus as healer is history, fact, not fiction or legend. Now, there are more narratives to look at. However, due to time constraints, I'm going to save those other narratives for another episode. So let's dive in with our first healing narrative, as I mentioned a while ago, the cure of the centurion's son or servant. It's a bit unclear as to whether it's merely his servant or his son. And to what degree is it his son, right? Is it an adopted son, biological son? That's unclear. I'm not going to read the whole narrative here, nor will I read the entire narratives of any of the stories that I refer to today. And that's just simply for time's sake in today's episode. I'll leave the reading of the narratives for you to do on your own. Rather, what I'm going to do is simply highlight the relevant details within those narratives that are suitable for our purposes here of demonstrating the historicity of these narratives. Now, as I mentioned, the healing narrative of the cure of the centurion's son/servant is recorded by Matthew in chapter 8, verses 5 through 13, by Luke, and in his gospel, chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, and John, chapter 4, verses 46 through 54. And so right off the bat, we see that this narrative meets one of the criteria that historians use to assess the historical reliability of ancient events recorded in ancient records, namely multiple attestation. The more independent sources attesting to an event, the more likely the event is historical. For many scholars, the narrative in Matthew 8 and Luke 7 comes from the more primitive source tradition called the Q tradition, which is an unnamed source that both Matthew and Luke often pull from. That is independent of Mark and John, and then also independent of special Matthew tradition and special Luke tradition. Thus, Matthew and Luke's account for this specific narrative can't be counted as two independent sources, but rather a single source, assuming that the Q tradition is true. There's a lot of debate about it, but we're just going to assume, for argument's sake, the validity of the Q tradition. However, it's not just the Q tradition, that attests to this miracle. John also attests to it in John chapter 4, verses 46 through 54. And most scholars generally acknowledge that John is independent of the synoptics. Meyer bolsters this point. John P. Meyer, in his book, A Marginal Jew, Rethinking the Historical Jesus, Volume 2, Mentor, Message, and Miracles, Meyer bolsters this point by stating this: we would have to imagine the fourth evangelist spreading out copies of Mark, Matthew, and Luke in front of him on his desk and proceeding to pick out a verse here and a verse there from each of the synoptics, at times without any discernible reason or pattern. This is from page 724 of Meyer's A Marginal Jew, Volume 2. The implication here is that such imaginings are unreasonable. So, if we buy into Meyer's argumentation and conclude with most scholars that John is independent of the synoptics, what we have here are two independent sources for this miracle story of the healing of the centurion's servant and or son, thereby meeting the multiple attestation criterion. Now, what's interesting, as Meyer points out, is that this story meets the multiple attestation criterion in a unique way. Meyer writes on the following page 725 of the same book, again, volume 2 of his A Marginal Jew, he writes this: the only time in the catalog of gospel miracle stories a fully developed miracle story is attested in both Q and John. That two such diverse sources, which otherwise have relatively little in common, should agree on the core of a miracle story is itself a striking datum. With such unique multiple attestations, we can conclude that the diverse traditions of Q and John are most likely grounded in a single historical incident that dates back to the historical Jesus. So again, not only do we have multiple attestation with Q and John, but it's multiply attested to in a unique way, given the diversity of the Q tradition and John's tradition that he pulls from for his gospel. Now, the next criterion that this story meets is the criterion of discontinuity, also known as the criterion of dissimilarity. The criterion of discontinuity suggests that if a saying or action of Jesus is distinctly different or dissimilar from either the common Jewish traditions of Jesus' time and or the beliefs and practices of the early Christian church, well, then it's more likely the saying or the action did not come from these sources, but rather, most likely, came from the historical Jesus himself. So what's the detail that is dissimilar or discontinuous, right, in this narrative of the healing of the centurion's servant? Well, the Q tradition says that Jesus, quote unquote, marveled at the centurion's faith, and that's found in Matthew 8:10 and Luke 7:9. This is discontinuous with or unbefitting of the high Christology of the early church. Think about it. Why would this detail be present in the Q tradition unless it were true? It wouldn't serve any apologetical purpose, because the apologetical purpose is to convince the readers that Jesus is divine. In fact, this particular detail seemingly would work against apologetical purposes. And so the only reasonable explanation is that it actually happened. And so we have a detail that is discontinuous, dissimilar with the high Christology of the early church. So the only plausible explanation that the marveling of Jesus, that detail would be included, is that it's historically true. Well, my friends, I'm coming up on my first break. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Stay tuned. More to come on the other side. Welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. The Catholic Reason is a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. In today's episode, we're looking at evidence for Jesus the healer to provide reasons why we think that the gospel portrait of Jesus as a healer is not fiction, not legend, but history, historical fact. And we began to look at one specific narrative of Jesus the healer, and that is the cure of the centurion's servant or son, recorded by Matthew and Luke in Matthew chapter 8 and Luke chapter 7 and John chapter 4. And one of the criteria that this specific narrative meets, as we pointed out, was the multiple attestation criterion. We have two independent sources, the Q tradition, from which Matthew and Luke are pulling from, and their account of this miracle story, and of course, John's tradition. Two independent source traditions, thereby meeting the criterion of multiple attestation. And then before the break, I was pointing out how this specific narrative also meets the criterion of discontinuity or dissimilarity, because the Q tradition provides for us a detail, namely, Jesus marveled at the centurion's faith, which is discontinuous with the high Christology of the early church. In fact, this particular detail of Jesus marveling would seem to work against any sort of apologetical purposes of trying to persuade the reader that Jesus is divine. So in a sense, it works against apologetical purposes, which indicates to us that the only plausible explanation as to why this detail would be in there is because they were reporting what they have received, that it is true, that it is historically accurate. And so we have two criteria that are met for historical reliability: multiple attestation and discontinuity. So we have several things going for the historicity of this specific narrative. Now, the idea that this detail works against any sort of apologetical purpose meets another criterion, the embarrassment criterion. So not only is Jesus marveling discontinuous with the high Christology of the early church, thereby giving us reason to think that this detail didn't come from the early church, but has its origin in the historical Jesus, but this detail is a bit embarrassing. To speak of Jesus as marveling at such faith could possibly give readers the impression that Jesus was surprised by the centurion's faith, as opposed to him already knowing it, which would make sense if he's God, right? And so this detail would seem to work against the purpose of persuading readers that Jesus was divine. The only reasonable explanation as to why such a detail is included is because it actually happened. And the embarrassment criterion is a powerful criterion because that gives a strong indication that the author is not fabricating the event. Why would an author who is fabricating a story include a detail that could potentially lead his readers to reject the story and the person that he's trying to tell about? Why would they include such a detail if it could potentially lead to that? The only explanation is that they include it because it's accurate, because that's the way it went down, so to speak. And so we have the embarrassment criterion met. Yet another criterion that is met in this narrative, according to John P. Meyer, is the criterion of Semitisms. Semitisms are details within a narrative that indicate the influence of underlying Aramaic traditions and expressions. This is significant because the Gospels were written in Greek. There would be no reason for the Gospel writers to preserve such Semitisms in their Greek literature unless it was a tradition that came from a prior first century Palestinian community, especially when the Gospel writers are writing for a Gentile audience who would be unfamiliar with such Palestinian traditions and expressions. So the only reason why they would have it in there is because they're preserving the tradition that came from the first century Palestinian community, rather than fabricating and making things up. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to appeal to authority for this line of evidence because we don't have time, but Meyer cites an Old Testament scholar by the name of Uwe Wegner, the first name U-W-E. I'm probably mispronouncing that, and I apologize, but Uwe Wegner, and states this, quote, "The pre-Q tradition has a good chance," Meyer says, "of having existed in an Aramaic form before it was translated into Greek." And he states this on page 725 in volume 2 of his A Marginal Jew. Now, this means the story has its origins within the first century Palestinian community, which in turn makes the story even more historically reliable because it meets the criterion of early testimony. The earlier you have the story in relation to the events that the story is telling about, the less likely it is that there are legendary developments because you have eyewitness testimony to ensure the faithful transmission of the information. So here we have the criterion of Semitisms that are being met, but insofar as Meyer, following Wegner, is arguing for the Semitisms coming from a very early tradition, you also have the criterion of early testimony. Okay, so now we can add to this Semitic linguistic point the fact that both the Q tradition and the Johannine tradition anchor the story in Capernaum, which, as Meyer points out, is, quote, a border town where such figures as a centurion or an official of Antipas's bureaucracy would naturally be functioning. Again, that's on page 725 of Meyer's volume 2, A Marginal Jew. This, of course, adds to the historical credibility of the story on two accounts. First, it indicates the presence of an eyewitness. To have that sort of detailed knowledge that the miracle took place in Capernaum, where you have a centurion would have been functioning, it indicates an account by an eyewitness. Second, it's consistent with what we know from history about the Palestinian milieu. Centurions would have been in Capernaum at this time. So whenever you have this gospel report of a centurion having a servant who is sick and Jesus going and healing him in Capernaum. And the author is identifying, rooting the story in that historical locale. And we know from separate sources that a centurion would have been functioning in Capernaum at that time. That provides strong reason to conclude that the narrative is historically reliable, that we can trust what the Q tradition and what John are giving us and telling us concerning this healing of the centurion's servant or son by Jesus. So to wrap up our reflection on this narrative, it's important to note that none of these criteria by themselves prove the historicity of the core tradition. So you can't just look at one criterion and then hang your hat just on that one, although sometimes you have to do that, but it doesn't rest just on one. However, as Meyer concludes, taken together, these considerations make it seem more probable that behind the primitive tradition lies a historical event from the public ministry of Jesus. So when you put all of the evidence together, then you have a strong case for the historicity of this event. Jesus healed a centurion's servant or son. And of course, that was quoted from Meyer on page 726 of his volume 2, A Marginal Jew. All right, so let's now move to the story of the paralyzed man who's let down through the roof, as recorded in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Now, our analysis of this event will not be as in-depth as the previous one. However, there are some things that we can say in relation to the historicity of this narrative. First, there are several details in the story that fall outside the scope of apologetical, catechetical, or instructional purposes. And this is significant because whenever you have details that you find in there that go beyond the scope of any sort of instructional or catechetical or apologetical purposes, then you have to ask the question, well, why would the author go through the effort, make the effort to include such details, especially when you consider the cost, the expensive, how expensive it was to write such things, the limited amount of space. Authors had to be very intentional in ancient times as to what they were to include within their writings. And so, given that they include these details beyond any sort of instructional purposes, suggests that they're including it because they think it's true, because they're trying to preserve accurately the history. So what are some of these details? Well, for example, we're told that 4 individuals go up to the roof and help lower the man down. And then we're told that they dug a hole in the roof. Now, why would the gospel writers include these details? Again, they don't serve any apologetical, catechetical, or instructional purposes. They must have included these details because that's how it went down. 4 people taking them up, digging a hole out of the roof. It was embedded in the memory of those eyewitnesses such that they would transmit it because it's so out of the ordinary. And that the gospel writers include these details suggests that it's historically reliable. Secondly, these details don't just go beyond the scope of instructional purposes, but they indicate the presence of eyewitnesses. Now, I'm going to appeal to Meyer here for his line of argumentation as to why he thinks these details suggest the account of an eyewitness. But I'm going to have to save that for the other side of the break. I'm coming up on my second break. My friends, I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Stay tuned. I'll talk to you on the other side. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. In today's episode, we're looking at specific healing narratives in the Gospels that we have good reason to conclude are historically reliable, thereby further giving us reason to conclude that the gospel portrait of Jesus as a healer is indeed historically factual as opposed to fiction or legendary developments. Now, before our last break, we were looking at the narrative of the paralytic who's lowered through the roof, whom Jesus heals. And one specific reason that we gave to believe it's historically reliable is that there are details that go outside and beyond the scope of instructional, catechetical, or apologetical purposes, which for many historians suggests that these details are included for the sake of preserving the historical accuracy. The gospel writers would not, the only reasonable explanation, given the nature of these details, is that they are true. Now, secondly, these details don't just go beyond the scope of instructional purposes, but as I pointed out before our last break, they indicate the presence of eyewitnesses. And John P. Meyer takes this line of argumentation as well. He points out how the digging of the hole in the roof was so extraordinary that such an event must have, as he puts it, quote, stuck in the corporate memory precisely because of its strange circumstances. That's from page 680 of volume 2 of his A Marginal Jew. So the extraordinary nature of digging a hole out of the roof to lower the paralyzed man stuck in the memory. And that's a good reason to think it's historically reliable. Finally, this narrative meets the criterion of coherence with the unique style of Jesus. This criterion suggests that when a saying, expression, or action is distinctive or unique to the style of Jesus, departing significantly from those of the milieu in which he lived, well, then there's good reason to believe it's an authentic saying, expression, or action of Jesus. The relevant details in this narrative that are unique to Jesus are as follows. His saying, I say to you, in Mark chapter 2, verse 11. That's unique to Jesus. Jesus is healing the paralytic by his own power and not calling on God to do it. That's unique to Jesus. Jesus' declaration to have the power of himself to forgive the man's sins and not calling on God to forgive the man's sins. That's unique to Jesus. That's a claim to be divine. The very association of the healing with the forgiveness of sins, that's unique to Jesus. Each of these details are unique to Jesus. Thus, the narrative coheres with the common Jesus portrait, thereby indicating a reason to think its root is in the historical Jesus. So, on account of the details that go beyond the scope of instructional purposes, and also suggest the presence of an eyewitness, and on account of the criterion of coherence, we can conclude that the healing of the paralytic lowered through the roof is an event that has its origins in the public ministry of the historical Jesus. Okay, so let's now turn to the story of the paralyzed man by the pool of Bethesda, recorded by John in John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. Again, I'll leave it to you to read the narrative on your own. There are several details in this narrative that scholars have pointed to as evidence for its historicity. So let's look at those. First, like in the other narratives that we've looked at so far, there are details here that don't serve any apologetical, catechetical, or instructional purposes. For example, John reports on the geographical details of the pools, writing, quote, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Hebrew called Bethsatha, which has 5 porticos. That's John chapter 5, verse 2. So we have there details lacking instructional purposes, right? There's no apologetical, catechetical, or instructional purpose for John to tell us, where this pool is at and that there are 5 porticos. No purpose there, except the fact that this is where it happened and this is historically true. Second, this precise knowledge of the features of the area by the sheep gate a pool, called in Hebrew Bethsatha, with 5 porticos. That suggests the presence of an eyewitness. That suggests an eyewitness account. Even the knowledge of its connection with the healing cult suggests an eyewitness account. That someone from that time knowing that these pools, not just that there were these pools there, but also that people thought they had healing powers. That's coming from the first century eyewitness. Meyer argues along these same lines, stating, quote, "The knowledge of the pool's location and their connection with the cult of healing shows remarkable acquaintance with the details of life in Jerusalem in the pre-70 AD period." He states that on page 681 of volume 2 of his A Marginal Jew. So we have here, we have details lacking instructional purpose. We have a detail that suggests an eyewitness account. Now, Meyer also notes that the paralyzed man's behavior meets the criterion of dissimilarity. For example, the man expresses hesitancy to answer Jesus' question as to whether he wanted to be healed. There in verses 6 through 7, Jesus asks, "Do you want to be healed?" And rather than saying yes, the paralyzed man talks about how he has no one to put him into the pool and his inability to make it to the pool before the others, as John records in verse 7. Now, as Meyer argues, this doesn't fit the stock character of many stereotyped miracle stories. Meyer sees in this dissimilarity or discontinuity an important enough to add to the pile of evidence for the historicity of the healing story. So given that the paralyzed man's response is unlike many of the miracle stories where everybody wants to be healed immediately, that leads Meyer to conclude that, hey, along with this other evidence, this is strong reason to think that this miracle story is indeed historically reliable, having its origin in the historical Jesus. It's not fabricated. It's not legend. Now, another detail that supports the historicity of this narrative is that we have extra biblical corroboration concerning the features of the area that John describes. For example, the copper scroll from Qumran confirms that there was an area of Jerusalem called Bethesda or Bethsatha and connects it to an area of pools that people entered. Moreover, there's the 19th century archaeological dig near the Church of St. Anne in Jerusalem that unearthed 2 large pools, along with some smaller pools nearby them, which scholars confirm include the Pool of Bethesda mentioned by John. So we have archaeological confirmation. So not only do we have details going beyond instructional purposes, details suggesting eyewitness account, the criterion of dissimilarity being met, but we also have extra biblical confirmation of some of the details. Now, the last thing to point out about this narrative of the healing of the paralyzed man at the Pool of Bethesda is that it's only one of 2 miracles in Jerusalem recorded by John. Now, such restraint in reporting such Jerusalem miracles is for Meyer a strong indication that John is trustworthy concerning this miracle, along with the other Jerusalem miracle of the man born blind recorded in John 9. Meyer puts the argument this way, quote, "It hardly strains credulity to suppose that during Jesus' ministry, there was more than one person in Palestine suffering from some form of bodily paralysis. In fact, if one holds that Jesus' ministry lasted for more than 1 year in that, as most religiously inclined Palestinian Jews would, Jesus regularly went up to Jerusalem for the great pilgrimage feast, one would be surprised if the famed miracle worker from Nazareth performed no miracles in and around the holy city. What is surprising instead is that granted the great emphasis John's gospel gives to Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem, the 4th gospel has only 2 full-blown miracles said in Jerusalem proper. This healing in John 5 and the healing of the man born blind in John 9. He goes on, despite John's intense focus on the Jerusalem ministry, John has not gone out of his way to flesh out that ministry with a large number of miracle stories. So the restraint of John's reports of miracle stories in Jerusalem is evidence for the historicity of these healing narratives. Because of John's emphasis of the Jerusalem ministry, and given the reasonableness that Jesus would have been performing quite a few miracles in the holy city, the fact that John only records 2 miracles in Jerusalem, again, gives strong indication that John's not just making this stuff up. He's proving himself to be credible and historically reliable, exercising restraint with the number of miracle stories he's going to include. So why does he include only these 2? Because he sees them sufficient and historically reliable enough that he thinks these are okay to include. So we have 5 lines of evidence for the historical credibility of the healing of the paralyzed man at the Pool of Bethesda. Number 1, it contains details that lack apologetical, catechetical, or instructional purposes. Those very same details are indicative of an eyewitness account. Some of those details meet the criterion of dissimilarity, and we have extra biblical corroboration of the pool and its association with the healing cult. Now, this provides us good reason to conclude. So I think I might have said 5 lines, but that's 4 right there. So I apologize for that. This provides us good reason to conclude that the portrait of Jesus, the healer, is an accurate portrait. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the last narrative that we'll look at in today's episode, and that's Jesus' healing of the deaf-mute man, recorded by Mark in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. And there, whenever we come back on the other side of the break, we're going to look at several lines of evidence that give credence to the historicity of this particular healing narrative. We'll look at some details that meet the criterion of dissimilarity, the criterion of embarrassment. It has some Semitisms and other things as well. My friends, stay tuned. More to come on the other side of the break. Well, welcome back, my friends, to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason, where we're looking at specific healing narratives in the Gospels and arguing for their historicity, given reasons why we can conclude that these narratives are historically reliable and that the gospel writers are communicating to us healing events that we can root in the historical Jesus, that these stories are not fabricated, nor are they legendary developments, but that they are indeed historically accurate tellings of these miracles that Jesus performed, thereby giving us reason to conclude that the gospel portrait of Jesus as a healer is historically accurate and not legend or fiction. Now, the last narrative that we're going to look at in today's episode, as I mentioned before our last break, is Jesus' healing of the deaf-mute man in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. And there are several lines of evidence that give credence to the historicity of this narrative. The first is that there are details that are unusual. That's to say, out the ordinary pattern of miracle stories in the Gospels and in Mark. As Meyer notes on page 713 of his volume 2, A Marginal Jew, such details fit within the pattern of symbolic ritual, which is more consonant with magical practices and is outside the ordinary pattern of Jesus' miracles. So, for example, we're told that Jesus put his fingers in the man's ears. That's very unusual. It's unique and is nowhere else to be found in the entire miracle tradition of Jesus. Moreover, Jesus directly applies his spit to the man. There's only one other place where Jesus directly applies his spit in Mark's miracle tradition, the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. John records Jesus using his spit when he heals the man born blind in John 9. However, the difference there is that Jesus doesn't directly apply his spit to the man, but rather mixes it with mud. But yet here in Mark, we have Jesus directly applying his spit. So Jesus' direct application of his spit to the man is unique in the Markan miracle tradition. The uniqueness of that detail suggests historical accuracy and reliability. Or to state it differently, provides high probability that this event has its origins in the historical Jesus. But what's even more unique, not only to the Markan tradition, but all 4 Gospels, is Jesus directly applying his spit to the man's tongue, all right? And so that is going to provide yet another reason to think that this has its origin in the historical Jesus. There are other unique elements as well. For example, Mark tells us that Jesus looked up to heaven and sighed, there in verse 34. And as noted by Meyer, the only other times where Jesus looks to heaven while performing a miracle are when he prays over the loaves and fish before feeding the 5,000, as recorded by Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and when he prays to the Father before raising Lazarus from the dead, as recorded by John in John 11. Given the uniqueness and discontinuity of these details with the normal pattern of the Jesus miracle stories, we have at least a reason to conclude that this story of the healing of the deaf-mute man is authentic and has its origin, again, in the historical Jesus. Now, these very details, these details that are unique and discontinuous with the normal pattern of the Jesus miracle stories, also serve to meet the criterion of embarrassment. So let's look at these details yet again, but in light of the embarrassment criterion. The ritualistic acts, such as fingers in the ear and spit on the tongue, they smack of magic or magical practices. This is the stuff of ordinary magic workers of the milieu of Jesus' time. Thus, such details actually work against any attempts to persuade readers to adopt the belief that Jesus is divine, and thus unlike ordinary miracle workers or wonder workers. Such details were so embarrassing, so it seems that Matthew and Luke leave this story out of their Gospels. We have Mark including it, but Matthew and Luke seemingly don't want to have anything to do with it. So why would Mark include such embarrassing details if he were fabricating the story? Answer, he wouldn't. Therefore, we can conclude he wasn't making it up and is conveying a tradition that has its origin in Jesus. Likewise, the prayer that Jesus offers with his sigh would also work against any attempt to persuade readers that Jesus is divine. Why would he need to pray before performing the miracle if he were God? Including behaviors of Jesus that could sow such seeds of doubt would not be wise for someone who's fabricating a story. You're not going to provide opportunity for your readers to begin thinking that Jesus is not divine if you're fabricating a story to try and convince them that he is divine. Another reason to think that this story is historically reliable and most likely has its origin in the first century Christian tradition is the presence of Semitisms. In verse 34, Mark preserves the Aramaic command Ephatha. He then translates the word for us as be opened there in verse 34. And like we said before, the presence of such Semitisms provides strong reason to think that the story has its origins in first century Palestine, most likely coming from Jesus himself. But we can press this Semitic detail even further because it's unique. There's only one other place where a miracle story has Jesus speaking Aramaic, and that's the raising of Jairus' daughter from the dead, when he says, Talitha cum, in Mark chapter 5, verse 41. However, as Meyer notes on page 714 of his A Marginal Jew, volume 2, this is the only miracle of healing where Jesus' Aramaic words are preserved. Given this Semitism and its uniqueness, we have yet another reason to think that the story has its origins in the historical Jesus. Okay, now there's one last reason to think this story is historically reliable, and that is it's attested to by a saying of Jesus in the Q tradition. Matthew records in 11:5, where Jesus says, go and tell John, he's talking to John the Baptist's disciples, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. Luke's version is found in Luke chapter 7, verse 22. So the portrait of Jesus as a healer of the deaf is multiply attested to by two independent sources. The Markan tradition in relation to the specific narrative of healing the deaf mute man, and here in Matthew 11:5, the Q tradition, which is a passing reference to Jesus as a healer of the deaf. So we have multiple attestation to the gospel portrait of Jesus as a healer of the deaf. Moreover, such a portrait is attested to by multiple forms, both the narrative and the saying, which for many gives further confirmation of its historicity. So you not just have multiple attestation of the same form, but different forms, a narrative and a saying. Well, my friends, that's all the time that we have for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. My claim today is that the gospel portrait of Jesus as a healer is indeed historically reliable. We showed that Jesus' cure of the centurion's servant or son is historically reliable on account of the criteria of multiple attestation, discontinuity, embarrassment, along with the use of Semitisms and detailed knowledge of the Palestinian milieu. Those Semitisms and detailed knowledge of the Palestinian milieu further gives strong indication of an eyewitness account. And of course, whenever you have an eyewitness account, when you're doing historiographical research of ancient events within ancient reports, that's a golden detail, right, to have. That's a strong indication of the historical accuracy of the ancient report. We showed that the lowering of the paralyzed man through the roof is historically reliable on account of it having details that go beyond the scope of persuasive and instructional purposes. And the importance of that is, if you've got a detail that goes beyond those boundaries, like, why would the author include such a detail if it's not going to work towards instruction or apologetical or catechetical purposes? The only reasonable and plausible explanation is that he includes those details because he thought it was true, and he's preserving the tradition that he received. And those very details also suggest the presence of eyewitnesses. With the lowering of the paralytic through the roof, 4 men, hole in the roof, then eyewitness was there. That's how we have those details preserved for us, along with details that meet the criterion of coherence, so we argued. We showed that the healing of the paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda is historically reliable on account of details that go, again, beyond the scope of persuasive and instructional purposes and suggest an eyewitness account, along with details that meet the criterion of discontinuity or dissimilarity, and indeed were corroborated by archaeological findings. That's key. Whenever you have extra biblical sources, in this case archaeological findings, corroborating and affirming certain gospel details. And finally, we showed that the healing of the deaf-mute man in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37, is also rooted in the historical Jesus, on account of the criteria of discontinuity or dissimilarity, uniqueness of certain details, and the embarrassment criterion was met, along with Semitic details and independent corroboration from the Q tradition. Well, my friends, that's 4 healing narratives that we can trust accurately report on healings that are rooted in the historical Jesus. And I think reason permits, and perhaps even demands, the conclusion that the portrait of Jesus as healer is indeed history and not legend. Friends, thank you so much for listening to The Catholic Reason today. I invite you to join me again next week as we continue to look at Catholic claims and the reasons behind them. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless.